My name is Joe Phelan. I lead the work of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in India, but we're a global organization that works with around 200 multinational companies to create the conditions where more sustainable businesses will be more successful. We work towards achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And in that context, we're always very pleased to work with the UN Global Compact. And this webinar today has been organized by UN Global Compact Network India, but again with a global panel of speakers for a global audience, and also by the Alliance for Integrity. And we're going to be looking at the integrity, people, climate and sustainability aspects of supply chains and how they've been disrupted as a result of COVID-19. And I think, even more importantly, how businesses are responding, what strategies they're taking, and what's being effective. The aim of today is to hear from our panel, and I'll introduce them shortly. We'll ask a few. And the way that you do that is with Q&A. And when you're inputting your questions, please input them in the Q&A to everyone, and we'll distill them and we'll make sure that they get asked. So that's the mechanism for doing that. I've got a couple more housekeeping points just before I introduce the panel. So the first is that this session is being recorded, and Mr. Prakash, sir, if I could ask you to just mute your call for the moment. Thank you, sir. So this session is being recorded and it's available on YouTube Live. And the link to this is box, so you can follow it now and you can also follow it afterwards there. Then, what we're all learning, please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off. And then, if you're like me, remember to turn them on again when it's your turn to speak. And then, as I said, we'll ask those questions in the Q&A. So I'm very pleased with the panel that the UN Global Compact Network India and Alliance for Integrity have brought together. Very brief introductions, fuller bios are available for all of them. But we have Ms. Sharmeen Zaman, who's the Executive Director of the Global Compact Network in Bangladesh. And she has more than 20 years experience. She's an economist, and she's worked with international organizations, including the Harvard Institute for International Development, Ashoka Foundation, Canadian International Development Agency, ActionAid International, UNDP, DFID, and others. She's an expert on corporate social responsibility and private sector engagement. And she advocates for sustainable and responsible business practices at the national, regional, and global levels. So we're really pleased to have her with us today. And we also have Mr. Suraj Prakash, who's the Director of Finance for BEML Limited. He's got an education and a background in finance and accounting, and he's working with Bharat Earth Movers Limited, which is a large state-owned enterprise headquartered in Bangalore, I believe, in India. And he's responsible for implementing financial policies and systems, the strategic vision of the organization, and devising and implementing strategies for short-term and long-term growth. And I think that's maybe the toughest job at the moment, is trying to look long-term when everything's been shaken up, as it has. We also have Ms. Shubha Sekar, who is Director of Human and Workplace Rights for Eurasia and Africa with the Coca-Cola company. She has over 2 decades experience of international and cross-functional human rights, sustainability, sustainable business, responsible sourcing, corporate social responsibility, law and government. And she has a unique and practical understanding of responsible and sustainable business. And she's currently part of the Global Workplace Rights Department as Regional Director, Human and Workplace Rights, and is responsible for implementation of Coca-Cola's human rights and responsible sourcing policies, across the Indian subcontinent, Middle East, North Africa, Turkey, Central Asian republics, and the Caucasus region. So a really big portfolio. And we have Ms. Rosalind Awadwi-Pratt, who's the Supply Chain Governance and Compliance Manager with Diageo Guinness in Ghana. She's a supply professional, so we'll be drawing on that expertise. And she's got a track record of strengthening compliance, improving processes, assuring quality and customer satisfaction, and prides herself on being a leader of integrity and one who inspires teams to deliver exceptional results. So that's our panel. And the focus, so thanks to them for joining us. And the focus for us today, as I said, is to first to understand what disruptions this pandemic has caused us, and to understand with specific geographies and sectors what have been the physical disruptions to our supply chain, what have been the economic disruptions. COVID hasn't happened in a vacuum, so we already had a sustainability, and there's a geopolitical agenda as well, which is going on in parallel and being accelerated by this COVID crisis. So where nations want to source products and supply chains from, and where they want to sell to, is being disrupted as well. So we want to, as businesses are being asked very quickly to reorganize in the midst of these disruptions, we want to understand first, what's happening, and secondly, how they're responding. First, to ensure continuity of supply and production, but also how they are ensuring continuity of quality and compliance and integrity, which is very challenging when everything is being shaken up and the ability to move around and inspect is reduced and so on. So that's the agenda. As I said, please submit your questions as we go through, put them in the Q&A, and we will collect them and we'll have time for them. We're going to finish this session in about 80 minutes from now, which will be 7:30 p.m. India time. I think that's 3 p.m. Central European time. So we will finish on time, but there will also, included in the session, there certainly will be time to get to your questions. So please put them in. I'd like to start with Rosalind. You work for Diageo Guinness, or Guinness Diageo in Ghana, an important employer. I don't know that Guinness counts as an essential product in all territories, but it's an important business in the economy there and a major employer. What have been the challenges that you've been faced there in keeping the business going? With restrictions on movement and restrictions, needing to protect employees. What have the disruptions been that you've experienced?
Here in Guinness, Ghana, and Ghana specific. So your first assertion, Guinness was considered, or the business was considered, an essential service when we were having our in-market restrictions. So at least we were allowed to produce. So the key thing was, with the lockdowns, you were allowed to produce. The tail end of your route to consumer was allowed to open up because they were also considered essential services. The middle part, the actual route to consumer itself, there was a gray section. Could distributors also still continue working? So you have the product sitting if you were still producing, but now how to get it straight to the consumer became the issue. There was also the issue of a sourcing problem. So most of your raw materials, or about 50% of them, are coming from outside. You're importing them. These are restrictions going on across the globe. Issues started from Asia, then it moved to Europe. Where in Africa, it hadn't hit us yet, but we started feeling the impact. You would check your business continuity plans. Procurement teams, sourcing teams would be liaising with their various suppliers and asking them, are you good to produce? Are you able to ship? So initially they'd say yes. And as lockdowns started coming up across their countries, they couldn't produce. They weren't essential services. They couldn't ship. So now you go to your second alternative supplier. That's alternative supplier. They also have lockdowns as well. They cannot ship as well. So you realize that most of the plans you had put in place prior to any disruption happening now was actually had a tendency to fall apart. So you don't have external raw materials coming in. You have CAPEX projects that need to go along. So if you're lucky, most of the installations came through before the lockdowns went in. But you need technical expertise also to come down to work. Here's the case, borders have been closed. So technical expertise can't come in. You have your installations sitting, your CAPEX projects cannot continue. People development plans also had to be put on hold so you could devise a new plan to ensure the trainings were going on. A myriad of issues. Now you're considered essential. Team members have to come to work. How do you motivate someone who's more or less a bit, we don't know much about the virus here in Africa, so you expect me to come out to work, but then coming out means you're exposing me. How do you assure the person you've put in place risk mitigation plans that will mitigate the risk, not necessarily eradicating them? You're sure you're going to be taking very good care of them, but people, it is an emotional one. How do you get your team members to trust you to come into work when there's lockdown and others are actually staying at home? So it was a myriad of issues for us. Route to consumers were down, supply of raw materials, you couldn't get everything coming in, and your alternative suppliers couldn't help you. And now you had to motivate your teams to also come in as well. Understand that it's a long-term decision you need to be taking. Shutting down today might mean you don't have sustainable employment tomorrow. So we had disruptions around all those areas, not just the main supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, I'm nodding because I have no experience of Ghana, but this kind of very quick realization from the government that marking certain products or services essential doesn't work because everything's interconnected. And so in the markets that we work in, very quickly, understanding the upstream part of, for example, food production, as well as the downstream part, and what you were saying about with the logistics piece as well, and the offtake of goods, and then you've just described all the things, and this experience of plans not being able to cope, no modeling or no plans designed to cope for a scenario like this, right?
Yeah.
And then very importantly, the human development, the capital infrastructure investment, and the people investment as well, challenges with both of those. So, and employee safety and trust. So some really important pieces. And I want to get a picture from the other panelists, and then we'll come back and look some more at what you've been doing to overcome these, and sharing those with the audience.
Sure.
So Shaman, if I can come to you next, you're based in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh plays a really important role in global supply chains. A couple of global supply chains stand out to me: made garments, certain agricultural products, and also it's a market where standards and assurance has been very high profile in the last 5 or 6 years. It's been something that the country has wanted to address very seriously in order to keep its stake in global supply chains. So, what have you seen happen with COVID, in terms of disruptions, both on the physical side, but also kind of on the assurance side?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Joe. Can you hear me properly? Hello?
Yes, hear you well, yes.
Okay. All right. So in the Bangladesh case, I think I want to highlight that the disruption has hugely impacted not only the supply chain, but the whole idea of business as usual. I think what is really important here is that the countries in the northern hemisphere is sourcing from countries like in Asia, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, especially in the ready-made garment and apparel sector. And I feel that, we have gone through a tremendous backward step in the sense with COVID-19 and the pandemic that has hit the industries. Across, I think, all industries we've been badly hit, but I think because ready-made garment sector is one of the top export-oriented sectors in our country, in Bangladesh, it has really employed over 4 million of the population. It accounts for a major portion of the GDP. And this is where we have had immense problems since March this year when the pandemic hit, because orders were in progress, orders were stopped, the factories that were sourcing, the brands that were sourcing from the factories in Bangladesh, they actually had to stop their work because there were a huge number of insecurities because of the occupational health and safety regulations. And as you know that the buyers and brands in the West, some of the brands were hand-holding the process, but most of them fell through. And this created a big gap, not only with the whole supply chain, but also it impacted the work very badly because the factories could not pay the wages to the workers. So we were really badly hit. And I feel that this pandemic is here, it's going to stay for a while, and we are still struggling how to cope. And the Bangladesh government
Sorry, Shaman. Sorry, Shaman. We just lost you.
But this is number.
We just lost you for a moment. So you're saying badly hit, and the Bangladesh government.
Bangladesh government created some safety nets for revamping the government sector of Bangladesh, but this amount is very and the amount of money that there has been, but this has really not been sufficient. The funding has not been sufficient. Workers have not been paid on time, and still factories are working at 50% of operational level. And this will create impact for those and impact significantly on women workers. As you know, more than 80% of our workforce in the garment sector are women who contribute to socio-economic development and to their household level income. And this indirectly will even affect the next generation. So I feel that, you know, this is a very critical subject matter that you've taken up about the disruption in the supply chains. It's a very crucial issue for all of us globally to think about, as well as regionally, because all countries, it's not only Bangladesh, but other sourcing countries are also being impacted negatively. And I feel that we need to have a collective action, which already there has been a lot of dynamics going on in the donor segment, but also governments are moving towards it. But I think this has to be not an ad hoc measure, it has to be a strategy that we need to fulfill, and it has to be a global strategy, because it's not on the onus of the factories themselves that are supplying, but it should also be the buyers that are responsible in purchasing practices and responsible business conduct. So I think it's also a matter of human rights, due diligence, and of course it relates very significantly to the SDGs, SDG 5, gender equality. It reflects on responsible production and consumption, SDG 12, and of course it also reflects to SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. So it's a partnership that we require, SDG 17, working in partnership, working together for a common cause of the well-being of not only the industrial sector, but well-being of the population of each country and the workforce. So they are secure when they work, they go out there, they have the measures, they have the safety nets in order for them to be productive as a workforce. Thank you.
Thank you, Charmin. So, fantastic messages. Ended business as usual, making explicit the links between one country where products are sourced from and markets in the West, and also spelling out very clearly that the impact, not buying a T-shirt for one person is not only a livelihood, but actually goes directly into very acute impacts in terms of, very quickly meals and shelter and hunger, and also affecting countries that are least able to manage the the shortfall in terms of the tax base and the coffers they have to be able to spend on a safety net that can see people through. People are vulnerable, and also your point about the long-term impact. So, devastating impacts for people, particularly female workers today, but the knock-on effect that has in terms of development. So very acute challenges. And again, reinforcing that the challenges in Bangladesh, the answers are in Bangladesh, but they're interconnected with the success and failure of other countries too, and a global approach being required. Thank you. So we'll come back and hear a bit more about steps that companies are taking. I
just want
the international brands, or please.
It's also this. Yeah, I just want to add here that it's very crucial that we as buyers also have that responsibility. It's not only the onus, it's not on the suppliers only. we talk about the northern impact of compliance and integrity, but we ourselves from the northern countries need to have that compliance and integrity measures ourselves for responsibility, taking the responsibility of the lives of the people that are impacted and the factories, because orders were already, I know I've been involved with a number of factories in this sector who have actually started the orders, started the shipments, and as my earlier speaker said, the shipments were a problem as well, was quite a challenge in this COVID situation with, you know, the overall environment for travel and restriction on trade. So it also happened that, you know, with all that going on, that buyers did not take responsibility. They gave the orders. The orders were supposed to be shipped, and then they did not pay. So I think it's very crucial that we look at integrity as well as social, environmental, and you know, economic compliance from both sides of the ball. And also, I think it's not only that the individual government should take you know, take a step forward on collective actions, but it should be the region as a whole, because Asia is sourcing to so many countries around the world. And so is Africa for other produce in the agricultural sector and others.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. And a powerful message about the importance of the actions and honouring responsibilities by business at this time. And you know, when no doubt times are difficult, but the way that companies act gets noticed and amplified and remembered. Thank you. Suraj, you're the Director of Finance, but effectively the Chief Financial Officer for BEML. You know, so it's you know, it's a really great set of skills and perspectives to complement, you know, the supply chain piece and the economic piece and the trade piece. You know, I know that you're responsible for setting short-term and long-term strategy within the business. So, you know, what's been the impact on your strategies and your processes, you know, and your business planning, you know, over the last few months?
Thank you very much, Mr. Joe, and my co-panelist. As it has been, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. As it has been very clearly brought out by my co-panelists also, that barring few sectors, almost all the sectors across the globe have been very severely impacted by this pandemic. For the simple reason that almost all the global economies are interconnected and depend upon various countries, more specifically on China for supply chain. So disruptions in each country due to pandemic and the subsequent lockdown, which was imposed to contain the spread of the pandemic, and with resultant closure of manufacturing facilities in various countries, has caused the supply chain disruptions, which has impacted the industry in general and manufacturing sector in particular. And the, of course, impact of such severity is not uniform across the sectors. It is not uniform across the country. It varies from sector to sector. It varies from country to country, depending upon its degree of dependence on other countries for the global supply chain. And of course, it also has been, it has also impacted the industry and manufacturing because of the domestic supply chain, which got disrupted, which got impacted because of the lockdowns and closure of facilities. Of course, I'll be restricting myself with reference to the specific impact in India, and that too, I'll be more focused on the impact of supply chain disruptions on the manufacturing sector in general, and more specifically on the company like BEML, which is essentially an engineering company. So the impact on the engineering company, a capital goods company like BEML, which is manufacturing a wide gamut of engineering products, which are essentially capital goods, and which caters to the core sectors under three diverse business verticals, that is rail and metro, mining and construction equipment for this particular segment, and of course into the defense and aerospace. So the impact of supply chain is not uniform across the three business verticals. If I talk of the company per se, or even if I had to talk about the engineering sector per se. And the impact on the both revenue as well as the bottom line has been very, very severe. And it has, of course, varied from segment to segment and vertical to vertical. And it has been more impacted in those cases where the dependence upon the foreign supply sources is more. So the biggest verticals which are having high level of indigenization and dependence upon global supply chains are less impacted, whereas the business verticals which are having higher dependence on the global supply chains are more impacted. So if I talk of my company per se, the mining and construction vertical, rail coaches, and the electrical multiple units which we manufacture, they have around 90% indigenization level. We talk of the high mobility vehicle under the defense segment, they have 80% indigenization level. And if we talk of metro segment per se, which is essentially urban transportation, mass urban transportation system, this has 65% approximately indigenization level. So basically high indigenization level insulate the relevant product lines from global supply chain disruptions, and have been impacted and are impacted only to the limited extent of the disruptions in the domestic supply chains, and which also got impacted apart from global supply chain for various reasons, like closure of manufacturing facilities during the lockdown period. And in certain cases, the impact has also been on account of the non-return of migrant labor, on which many of the domestic supply chain rely heavily upon. The global supply chains disruptions, especially in China, has also impacted the domestic supplies, because some of the domestic suppliers rely heavily upon the inputs or input supplies upon China. And of course, the domestic supplies have also been impacted by certain facilities or suppliers or vendors whose factories and manufacturing facilities are located in red zones or containment zones where the manufacturing has not yet picked up or are under disruption. It has also impacted the logistics because of, especially in the initial phase of the lockdown period, where the transport vehicles or the shipments got impacted due to non-availability of transport vehicles or the delayed availability of transport vehicles. And that was primarily because of the reason that in many cases, these shipping vehicles or the transport vehicles got stuck at various border posts, or in few cases, they were abandoned by the drivers. They were abandoned by the drivers for the simple reason that there was a lot of uncertainty among them about the fear of pandemic and also about the uncertainty about the lockdown lifting. And little bit of the impact on the supply chain has also been caused by, of course, the observance of strict social distancing norms and other hygiene protocols which have been enforced in workplaces, which has impacted the productivity to a certain extent, not to a great extent, but it has also been a factor, albeit its impact has not been significant to say. But when we talk of supply chain disruptions, global specifically, which is more on account of high dependence on China. If we talk of India per se, and if I talk of top 20 products which India imports from China, the average share of import of each product is around 30%. Of course, it varies higher to lower. If you look at electronics, they constitute 45% of the import which India makes from China. If you look at the active pharma ingredients, that is API, they constitute 70% of import from China, whereas 25% of automotive parts, fertilizers, 40% of organic chemicals, 33% of machinery, and 90% of mobile phone parts which India imports come from China. And that's a kind of dependence the global supply chain has, and this has a very serious impact. If you look at the export per se, the India top 5 partner, if we say, are of course the China, US, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. But if I talk of import versus export, India imports around 68.1 billion worth of goods from China, which is almost 14.2% of the total imports which India has. So China stands at #1 position as far as the India's import partners are concerned. And it is followed by United States, which is just 50% of what India imports from. It is just 7.2%, followed by UAE and Saudi Arabia, mainly on account of import of crude oil, etc. So that essentially, if you look at these are the crucial factors which have really impacted the global supply chain disruptions. So, and this global supply chain disruptions are not going to be restricted to the specific products which I mentioned about, but other products and industries which are associated with these industries. So the supply chain disruptions will have a very cascading and wide-ranging impact. So coming back to the industry in general, coming back to the manufacturing in general, coming back to the engineering capital goods industry and company like BEML in general, this the vertical or the segment which has the lowest indigenization content will be is relatively more impacted because of its relative higher dependence on the global supply chain, which includes not only China, but also like countries like Germany, Italy, South Korea, Japan. And the impact per se is not just occurring on account of supplies which are originating from the supplier which is located in the respective countries, but it is also on account of these suppliers whose supply chains disruptions have occurred as many of their inputs or components or subsystems which form part of the finished goods which they supply to us are including supplies from China and other countries which I just mentioned above. So this interdependence of supplies is having a cascading impact and has impacted the supply chain for a period much longer than the actual lockdown period, which has really pushed back the contract execution, has impacted the revenue with a consequential impact, of course, on the bottom line. So just to give a particular example to illustrate the point without naming the country, a particular system which particular system, I'm talking of a system per se, when I manufacture a product where it comprises of large number of components, it comprises a large number of systems and subsystems and assemblies. So if a particular system which forms part of the finished product which a company like us manufacture, though it is supplied from country A, the supplier per se is located in country A, but it has a number of components and subsystems which they are importing or are being supplied from different manufacturers, say in country B, C, and D. And finally, the complete system is manufactured, assembled, and integrated in the country A, which is the main supplier. And after that, it is subject to very rigorous testing protocols. And only after successful testing, the same can be dispatched to our manufacturing facilities for further integration into the finished product. So the point which I'm trying to make is the impact in one is getting cascading down to the several level. So this kind of supply chain disruption has a very cascading impact, not only on account of lockdown conditions which happened, but will also get further happen, which will get further hampered due to manufacturing delays, pending clearance of testing protocols and design modifications. In case after the testing, certain design modifications or other things are required, and they need to be reworked, whether in terms of designing or in terms of component redesigning, it will have a very, very cascading impact. So the company, engineering company like BEML will have a very different kind of impact per se. Now, coming to the other two verticals, which are having comparatively lower import content, which I just shared about the three business verticals and their indigenization level, and their global supply chain disruptions impacts are not much significant, and that is not much of concern. But there, the domestic supply chain has impacted the revenues, but that, of course, impact is not much greater as it is compared to the global supply chain disruption. And impact of the displaced supply chain has, of course, been for various reasons, which I just mentioned about. It is logistics, it is closure of facilities, it is location of facilities in the red zone or the containment zone, or it is the domestic supplies, again, dependence upon their global sources like China, Japan, Italy, etc. So what I'm trying to make a point essentially is that because of interconnected global supply chain, though it is not feasible for any company or any industry per se to accurately assess the exact amount of supply chain disruptions, but companies like us or any other manufacturing company will have to constantly monitor and assess the situation as things evolve till the complete global supply chain as well as the domestic supply chain returns back to the normalcy. The point which I was trying to make was essentially the impact on the revenue and impact on the bottom line. But it is not just restricted to impact on the revenue and impact on the bottom line. It has thrown a lot of liquidity challenges which have been specifically impacting the manufacturing sector per se. Because of the supply chain disruptions for us, now what is imperative for us is to devise the strategy so that we avoid piling up of inventory and blocking of working capital into non-saleable products. You would appreciate that essentially, even in case we do the best possible scenario planning, we do the best possible measures to assess the supply chain, to assess the impact on our vendors and their down the line supply chain, and try to minimize the supply chain risk, which ultimately, even if it results in even a single supplier failing to supply, or even a single item which is not received in time, because the components engineering which you manufacture incorporates number of products, number of items, number of systems and components. So even a failure of a single supplier, failure of even a single item not being received in time will result in very, very high inventory. Even though that particular item which I'm talking about may have a very minuscule share of the total cost of the product, will result in conversion of all these production into a non-saleable product, because unless I'm able to finish the product and convert into a saleable product, this will result in huge liquidity issue, because I will have a piled up inventory in an unfinished form which will not be a saleable and which will not be converted into sales and cash. So essentially, liquidity post supply chain disruptions has been a big issue. We have seen the downward trend in the cash inflows. Whatever inflows used to be coming, they have come down significantly, whereas the cash outflows are going to be served. So that is essentially, unless we supply this, serve the supply chain, we are not going to get the supplies. And the manufacturing sector, if you say, in one of the survey reports, it has come out that 70% of more than 40,000 companies are having less than 2 months of cash to employee cover ratio. Just less than 2 months of cash to employee. I am not counting in this the fixed costs and overheads. They, in any case, will have to be incurred in case you have to continue with the business. So the situation on liquidity front is also very, very grim. And another big challenge for the manufacturing sector, specifically the CPSCs, as I just mentioned you, for the sake of the participants who are from abroad, I would like to explain. CPSC, when I refer to, is essentially a central public.
Let's come back to that, because we should come back to that. But what I want to do is take this liquidity crisis that you've rightly highlighted, and that it's a consequence of the way that you were describing the components that get pulled together and are tested in different markets, and each piece has to work in order for them to come together at the right time to be sold. And any disruption in that causes this liquidity crisis, which then very quickly translates into people being laid off, and then a humanitarian and a social disaster. So it's a critical issue. And what I wanted to do was come to Shubha, because Shubha, you're kind of in a central role with Coca-Cola, where you're doing supply chain due diligence, and governance. You're overseeing supply chain, especially from a business and human rights perspective and a due diligence perspective, and ensuring that supply chains can flow, with good oversight, especially with a kind of social and human rights lens. Now, how is your ability to do that being disrupted by this crisis? And I'll come back to each of the panelists one more time as well for follow-up questions. But should it be great to hear, from this central role, trying to make what's been happening.
So thank you, Joe, and greetings to everyone from New Delhi, India. I would like to thank UN Global Compact Network India and Alliance for Integrity for inviting me to be on this panel to discuss a very important topic at this, this period. Now, supply chain disruptions have many dimensions to it, and we've heard three of the panelists talk about, certain specific areas, of these disruptions. Now, I will be really talking about perspectives on the people in supply chains from a business and human rights point of view. Having worked in this field in Coca-Cola since 2007 and handling some of the difficult markets with complex issues pertaining to supply chain. Now, the pandemic has demonstrated to the world the importance of human rights in supply chains and the really the great importance and responsibility of business over its supply chains. I think Shahameen mentioned about that, about the human rights due diligence. Now, just very briefly about Coca-Cola so that you understand the context. Now, Coca-Cola was an early adopter to the human rights approach, and our policies and processes are very closely aligned to the UN guiding principles, which is the framework on which all of business and human rights have been drawing from. And this, we believe, is fundamental to operating a sustainable and responsible business. Now, basically, we have two policies, human rights policies, called the Supplier Guiding Principles and the Human Rights Policy, which applies to our supply chains, that is consisting of our bottling plants, which does our manufacturing, and our suppliers. And these requirements are embedded in our supplier authorization and our procurement processes. Now, the challenge to the corporate sector, and we've heard some of the insights, was that when the pandemic started, there was no SOPs, no single way to identify what its impact would be. There's no list of COVID-related human rights issues. So all companies had to, learn and act, all together. There was no way that anyone knew what was happening. Now, some of the challenges, which we faced is one, like all the businesses, including ours, as to how do we protect the health and safety of our workflows, especially the vulnerable sections. And the second part, the challenge that we faced is one of the very important due diligence tools that we use in our global supply chains, and we operate in 200 countries. So you can imagine the length and breadth of our supply chain. And so we do these third-party auditing, every year. So we've done about 25,000 till now, about 3,000 every year. And this is a very important tool to test, adherence to our human rights policies and to compliance. Now, when this, country after country went into lockdown, we had to pause these in-person third-party assessments. The third challenge, and at that point, we didn't know, how long will this be? How do we kind of, so the third challenge was that, the pandemic disproportionately impacted the vulnerable sections of society all over the world. And many of the human rights issues in supply chains have their roots in poverty, inequality, vulnerability, and leading to exploitation. And that's where the risks in the supply chains come, which are inherent, in each country and each region where a global brand like us operates. And so, as I mentioned, as a company deeply committed to human rights, the concern is that when these vulnerabilities and poverty increases, then the risks increase. However, before I end, I'd like to just say that, we believe that every set of challenges has a set of opportunities. And there was a realization all around that businesses that have very mature human rights programs, which have robust due diligence tools, which have governance frameworks, cross-functional crisis management teams, had shown the best resilience during the crisis and recovery. And these enable the businesses to quickly come out of issues by innovating. So basically, these are the challenges, and we'll be happy to discuss how we kind of worked around these challenges at some point.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, so we'll come back because it would be good to hear more about the due diligence tools and how cross-functional teams, especially on any examples of innovation, but just what your experiences have been in working through this. I want to remind everyone that you can ask questions of the panel. You do this in the Q&A to everyone. I know there's a Q&A function, a chat function, and you can do it to everyone or to the panel, but please if you can, put it in the Q&A to everyone, and we will take your questions. I want to just ask each of the panelists now a bit more on, what approach you've taken to solve the challenges and to keep up and running, and the challenges that you described, or at least the companies that you work with. And Roslyn, you talked a lot about the importance of building trust with employees, the impact on people development plans on capex and so on. And how did you what strategies did you take to address this, and how successful were they?
So I said earlier that challenges were myriad, and then for Guinness Ghana, Diageo broadly, for crisis like this, and this is a very major crisis, usually there's a priority list. So first on it is people. How has this crisis impacted the people? Then environment. From environment, you come to your customers and your consumers. And then now you come to internal business processes and procedures. How is this impacting us? So on the people front, to borrow Sugar's term and earlier, honoring our responsibilities. So we came up front first and told the whole populace of employees. We've been classified as essential producers. We can choose to produce, or we can choose to shut and wait till the tide is over. But here's the case, we don't know when the tide is over. So these are ABC, what we're going to do to protect you, to ensure that when you're coming to work to ensure business continuity, we are mitigating the risk for you. The preventive measures that are being asked for, PPEs that are being required, business will provide for you to use whilst you're in the premises, and even when you're going back to your homes, business will provide. We're providing the PPEs for employees. We're also ensuring that for those that were supposed to come in by business provided transportation, we enlarge the fleet. We double the fleet up to ensure even social distancing could be observed in these buses, to give the employees the assurance that everything we need to do to protect you, we are going to do to ensure that business continues as well. And then also for teams that didn't need to be in the office to be able to work, we sent them home. They were working from home. The guys that were in main production had to come to the breweries. If for one reason or the other, we didn't need you to work for a long period, we put you on annual leave. So people weren't being laid off. The first priority, the first principle was, as much as possible, protect the employment of each and every person, whether it's a contract-based person, whether it's a fixed-term employment person, protect their employment. Can they take leave rather than you laying them off for that short period of time? So that's what we did for our people. And then for the capability sessions that had been planned that couldn't come on face-to-face, is there something we can do virtually that we could do? So do not kill the development of your people, do not necessarily cut the employment of your people, put them on annual leave, and as the situation unravels, you know what the next decision to take was. So people were our first focus on this particular one. Then we came to our customers and our consumers. How are our customers faring? Like I said earlier, a major part of our route to consumer was not considered essential. So our on-trade customers could not open up. Only the off-trade or the estate groceries could open up. So it was just an off-trade business that was working. How do you ensure that the on-trade that is currently not working, they are not fully impacted? So now the business went to them and told them, there's this other option. You need to follow the regulation. You can convert a bit of your business to an off-trade one, but these are the regulations around it. If you can make the investment, it's not just for today, it also ensures that in the long term, even after it blows over, you have a second line of business. Even for us, we were usually face-to-face selling because of the kind of product we have. Now we have to go back, rethink, can we use e-commerce? Can we use telesales to ensure that even though the big chunk of distribution is gone, there's another avenue for us to be able to make up? Because you realize demand has gone down, but then you're making investments also ensure the safety of your people. Money is not coming in, but money has to go out because your people are very important. So sales has to go on to ensure the business continuity as well. And then there was a bit about making alliances with competition. So it's like getting into bed with the enemy, sort of. But then you have to make an alliance with the competition to ensure that we present a united front to government. So government is the one bringing these restrictions. It's based on government restrictions that our route to consumer is not working very well. How do we work together as an industry to ensure if we each put in these preventive measures, if we each take a step to do these, will government listen to us and say, maybe we should open up a section of the route to consumer we've closed up? So essentially, go to your competition, speak with your competition, align with your competition. Which guidelines can we follow to ensure that the route to consumer is also opened up? And then innovating. So this wasn't the time for innovating new products for our industry. It was a time of innovating in terms of processes. Like I spoke earlier, can we do telesales? can we do e-commerce? Customers are starting looking at both levels of an on and off trade. So basically, those were the main key things that drove the response that we gave to the particular crisis, and it's still also actually working. And then having the mentality that's like, I think it's one other colleague said on this panel that it's not going to end today. So understand that it's a journey. So as you go through the journey, you find temporary opportunities there. Ensure that the temporary opportunities can become permanent solutions. By the time COVID probably is over, none of us is going to go back to the initial state where we ought to have changed, we ought to have metamorphosized. So developing the capabilities of your people to be able to deliver in the new normal that's coming up after post-COVID, and ensuring business is continuing their sustainability. But people was key for us, then our customers and consumers, before we even looked internally at what do our P&L look like and how would a dip in demand and also the investments we need to make to protect our people, how do we make sure the business is sustainable? On the source front, the procurement front, now you need to look at some of your raw materials are coming from outside. Is there an opportunity to develop a local value chain for some of the key items? So usually you'll be buying 100% of those particular raw materials from outside, but there are local producers who can also give us. The question here is quality. How do you also support them to get the quality that you need, the quality that's making you go out to always buy? So if you can work with local producers to develop a local value chain, a local supply chain for some key raw materials, and then letting them know these are the quality specs that we look out for. A, B, C are the things you can do to get your quality to the level that we need. It's an industry. If that's off-taking, others will also off-take from you. And then you guarantee that once they've developed to that particular level, you're not picking 100% from outside, and maybe 80-20 from local. So there's, in the event where there's another crisis like this, when all other alternate suppliers are failing, you're developing local people as well to also help you. So in the end, it develops the whole country as well. So those are the various areas and the various things that we have done so far, and I still do.
Thank you.
Journey well.
Thank you. So, I mean, really interesting there at the end, you were talking about what Suraj was talking about with the indigenization of supply and what international supply chains are disrupted and slowed down. You know, very different sector you're in, but being able to source some products locally. I think, you know, this thing about the trust with your employees and the partnerships you have with your vendors and your other business partners, you know, that's leveraging things that you've developed over a long period of time, it seems to me. And then the speed to partner with, you know, your competitors in the sector to do advocacy and, you know, and to innovate around, you know, telesales and so on. You know, so this mixture of building on your long-term strengths and then the speed as well. So thank you very much. Charmin, you know, we were hearing about the scale of the challenge in Bangladesh, especially in the made garment sector, employs 4 million people. The restrictions caused by COVID are impacting the ability to do occupational health and safety, which is very important in that sector, and with the vulnerable communities that work in it. And then there's the you know, the whole demand side with orders being cancelled and not honoured. You mentioned a bit about steps that the government was taking to create a safety net and to work with IFC and World Bank and others. But I'm interested to know, you know, what strategies are you helping and advising companies to take, either on the inward-looking assurance of occupational health and safety, or on the more market-based aspects, because your sector is unique in that the market for what you make is international. Not unique, but unique on this panel. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Interesting, because like when the COVID situation initiated, actually, and this whole disruption in the supply chains, I, as part of it's called Foreign Trade Association, now called Amfori, I'm on the board, and we started, we formed a task force. And this is the Business Social Compliance Initiative that's worldwide for the European markets, and in the garment sector and the food industry in Africa. So we started thinking that how can we help the sector, not only in Bangladesh, but in Asia, Southeast Asia, perspective. And of course, major, as my speakers before me said, that China is the main source of most of the supply chains. And we looked at what are the issues, what is the main objective of the task force is actually ensuring that there's due diligence of human rights, ensuring that workers get paid, ensuring that the supply chain does not get disrupted through this pandemic, and how can buyers and sellers contain this by working together and negotiate together. And so we actually raised funds for the Bangladesh garment manufacturing industry with the other consortium partners, global consortium partners. But one thing I want to raise here is what's very important. We have internal challenges within the factories. We have external challenges due to fund flow and access to financing, where we also sort of had social dialogue with the financial sector of the country and other financial sectors globally, that whether they can support the garment sector in order to sustain it in the long run. The other issue is that the internal challenges that were faced by the garments factories themselves was occupational health and safety that Shubha just mentioned. And this is huge pressure for the factories. And factories themselves some of the bigger factories set up task forces and started talking with the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturer Association, which they are all members, to how to mitigate these risks and start a sustainable system that can, in the long run, that can actually be doable. Because we look at various issues. One is the vulnerable people that are engaged in the garments factories, workers that are there. The factories closed down. They had to go back home to their villages because they could not survive with no income in the urban cities. So that was one thing. The other thing is, how can you also reduce the distancing? How to contain that? Because Bangladesh is a high densely populated country, and especially if you look at the garment sector, which I mentioned, 4 million people are engaged in that sector. And how can you actually ensure occupational health and safety? This was a huge challenge for the factories themselves. And of course, the Labour Ministry of Bangladesh did support in various ways. And it also required technical support from the international donor community, where a lot of training and a lot of dialogue and discussions went on. So I feel that, one thing that really was obvious is that the global supply chains versus the domestic supply chains. So if you see globally what's happening, even in America, many of the sourcing is done from these countries, from China and other countries. So we are looking at a situation that is a continuous situation until the vaccine comes out for COVID-19. And we are looking at a situation where disruption will happen. As you know, people do not go shopping anymore, because they're scared to go shopping. The shops were closed. The apparel sector actually did not have any customers. When you look at the buyer point of view, the buyers did not have customers to sell their products. So it's a very, very gray area that we need to work together to resolve. But yet, where commitments are made, we have to have ethical purchasing practices. And BGMEA, the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturer Association, as well as the trade associations like Amfori, have created their ethical purchasing practice guidelines, which are being followed by maximum of the buyers. But I think there's more collective action needed. We need to actually dialogue and discuss, because risks like this pandemic was actually a new phenomena which happened this time, which affected the whole global business environment. And we need to create not only strategies, but operational strategies and how we can mitigate these risks. We need to have a risk factor into this whole dynamics of the business stream. And I think we have to work together, because this is not the first time. Maybe, I hope it's the first time and the last time that such a pandemic happens. But we have to continue in averting such risks and such natural calamities. Thank you.
Let me just ask you one question on the operational side. Are steps being taken, and this may already be in place, but on airflow and recycling and cleaning of air in garment factories, because this is something that's come up in other countries.
Right.
As being a vector. Yeah, just
Yes.
specifically on that.
Of course, there have been strategies in place. There have been operational strategies, and we are looking into it. But of course, it's a challenge also because some of the factories do not have sufficient technology for that. But of course, if you look at environmental compliance, and the issues of global standards, of course, factories have to have that in place. So this is something that the government and the private sector is working.
Great, good. So we've got quite a lot of questions in, so we're going to open up for that in just a minute. I just want to come to Suraj and Shubha just briefly if we can, because Suraj, I know you wanted to make another point earlier, and I'm also interested. I've got a question for you as well about your sourcing strategy, but I know you wanted to make a specific point. If you'd like to just make that, that'd be great.
Well, thank you, Joe. I will take that particular point later during the question answer session in case such a point is raised. But as coming back to how the disruptions in the supply chain are being addressed. So being a capital goods engineering company, the challenges and measures how to tackle this supply chain disruptions, this is going to be quite different than the other manufacturing sectors. In other manufacturing sectors, which are not essentially the engineering goods, we could look for an alternate sources and try to minimize the supply chain disruptions impact to the bare minimum. But in our case, it is very important to note that for engineering goods, they require technical proven supplies, that is technical proven products, technical proven component systems only to be used in the production of the manufacturing. Specifically, the systems or components which are having critical performance requirements. Now, in all these cases, whatever inputs or components goes, these are all something which are subject to very detailed testing protocols. They need to be technical proven, and after detailed testing protocols, which include field trials for a very long period, and they are they are approved and they are incorporated. And these conditions are not on account of our own internal technical norms, but they are also emanating from the field trials and other technical conditions, testing protocols determined by the customers. So essentially, it flows from both our internal quality perspective as well as the customer's perspective. So what happens in particular in such cases is that if you look for an alternative supply, the testing and technical provenness of the alternate source will take long time to complete. And as such, the alternate source, even if it is available, cannot be used straight away. And because it will have to be subject to the detailed testing, which I just explained, including the field trials. Moreover, in many of the engineering products which we deal with, and in fact, most of the engineering companies deal with, the sources or the specific components which have to be sourced are determined or approved by the customers per se. So in such case, looking for an alternate source is constrained on account of the customer vetting and also on account of technical trials, testing, and field trials, which are a long drawn process. And as such, as a short-term strategy, it is practically not possible to look for an alternative source per se, because such testing is a very detailed and long-term strategy. However, some of the non-critical components which do not have the testing protocols as specified, we are looking for the alternate source supplies. But in those cases, generally the supply chain disruptions are very, very less. But as a precautionary measure and as to avoid the future risk per se, for those we are looking for alternate source development where they are not subject to the detailed testing protocol. So essentially, as a short-term strategy, probably the only option left for a company like us is to minimize the impact by having a constant engagement with our suppliers, with our supply chain, and assess their ability to serve in time and to make available the products or goods which we require for our ultimate deliveries to the customer. So this will be not only assessing their ability to supply, but also assessing their cash flow status, because it will be very imperative to assess their cash flow status. In case their cash flow is distressed, they will not be in a position to supply to us, and that will cause further disruptions. So cash flow or liquidity per se, not only our liquidity, but the liquidity down the line of the supply chain is of very, very critical importance. So this liquidity, as far as we are concerned, we are looking forward by way of as a big challenge, and which is being addressed by constantly monitoring of the receivables and assessing the customer's cash positions. So here comes basically a trade-off. Now, efforts while essentially it is essentially managing short-term priorities and realigning it with the long-term goals, in the sense that essentially if you have certain supplies which have been disrupted and you have a choice of customers whom to supply, as a sound commercial prudence, you will prefer to make supplies to a customer who is a fast-paying customer or where the product margins are higher. But it will again be compromising between the short-term managing short-term priorities and the long-term strategic relationship, not only with vendors but also with the customers, because the customers who are giving you really lower margins or having lesser cash availability might be the ones who are your long-term partners, whereas the customers who are the ones who are willing to pay you more or willing to give you better cash might be the ones where your long-term strategic partnership. So essentially, in my opinion, it would be a set-off or a trade-off between your short-term priorities, managing them, and realigning it with the long-term strategy of preserving and maintaining the long-term partnership with your vendor base as well as with the suppliers or customers.
Thank you.
As part of the long-term strategy.
Well, because this is a really important, I think this is a crucial point to come out of this. This testing, testing for COVID-19, but this testing for cash flow and liquidity in your vendors, in your suppliers, and and not wanting to get caught up in a new contagion, which can further disrupt your business. Is I think a really important approach that all businesses, many will be, but those that aren't yet, this is going to be essential to success. If I can stop you and just come to Shubha, and then because then we're going to hear everyone's questions, and then everyone will each get all of the panel will each get a chance to respond one more time. Shubha, you were talking about the due diligence tools for managing supply chain. You're talking about cross-functional crisis management teams and innovation. So if you could just tell us also briefly a little about some successes and things that have worked that other companies might be able to follow.
Sure. Can you hear me, Joe?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. Okay, now, due to the very strong policies, processes, governance mechanisms that we have in place in the company, we were able to quickly come together at various levels, corporate, regional, at the local levels, to address different aspects of the challenge. Now, from a point of view of health and safety, I mean, obviously, it pandemic, so that was prioritized. Everywhere, the health and safety of employees, workers in our operations and our bottlings were prioritized. It was a 360-degree effort. There were cross-functional teams which came together. Apart from that, SOPs were prepared from taking best practices as a global company in 200 countries. They were countries which went into lockdowns first. There are countries which are emerging out of the lockdowns and restarting work first. So there's a lot of learning, from across the regions and across the system. And so there was, a whole lot of global calls were catalyzed. I've been part of several of it where, each week there would be updates. That was very interesting. And, apart from that, also, there were a number of webinars, for example, with our suppliers, because of the close relationship, also guiding them what to do, how to, keep people safe. So that's one bucket. The second one is what I talked about, the auditing, which is a very big process for us. We have, we send third-party independent auditors to, all our bottling locations all over, which are hundreds across the world, to our supplier facilities. And, when it paused, we could have just sat on the sidelines. But instead, we kind of felt this opportunity to test out some remote assessment and do some pilots. So we kind of used a virtual audit solution using audio and video facility. I in fact shadowed, what we call shadowing, as at times we go to see how how is actually working on the ground, and I was pleasantly surprised in terms of the efficacy of technology. And so there was robust document review, confidential worker interviews, health and safety walkthroughs. So these were some of the ways. So we we had a good experience, and we felt that this is a great opportunity to use these tools not to supplant in-person assessments. I mean, those have their own strengths, but in situations like pandemic, some future crisis, like for example, zones of conflict. I mean, we operate in several countries. Some of them are zones of conflict. Here is an opportunity where we can, supplement it along with other due diligence tools that we have. Now, the third part, which I mentioned is auditing is just one due diligence tool. I call this, it's like a basket of different types of tools that we need to use for different situations. I mean, again, calling upon the fact that, we're a multinational with operations in, more countries than the United Nations of the world. And so, increasingly we felt there is opportunity to use technology. So to give you an example from the Middle East, in the Gulf, there is a huge foreign migrant worker population. And there is this whole issue of modern slavery that happens, and it's a issue which has really caught global attention. There's several laws starting from California Transparency Act, the UK Slavery Act. Now, very early, much before these legislations came, we had started, we're through our third-party auditing, we started getting red flags, and I'm talking about 2007, 2008. And when we kind of started seeing issues, we immediately got about trying to understand. We prohibited forced labor in our supply chains. We included it in our auditing protocol. But despite that, we realized that there were certain issues which happened not in the workplaces of the Middle East when they came into our supply chains, but in the country of origin, from which they came. So we decided to pilot using blockchain. To address the specific issue of contract substitution that happened. That's one of the three big issues leading to forced labor. And, we kind of partnered with one of our bottling plants in the Middle East, along with a technology partner. And we started, using this as a means. And we got very good results, which really gives us hope that, we could look at, when the situation improves, to look at an end-to-end model, to bring in, ethical recruitment, to bring in the recruitment agencies and start from the country of origin. So, there could be several such examples, but what I'm trying to really stress is, when you have those governance, when you have cross-function teams, processes, it is possible to look at solutions to try and address, different kinds of issues.
Yeah, fantastic, fantastic. Thank you. Very good. Thank you very much. So what we're going to do now is Seema Chaudhary from the Alliance for Integrity is going to read out the questions. I think there are 6. There may be more than that. I think if it's around 6, we could probably hear them all in one go, and then have a go at answering them. And I'll keep track. And if we miss any, then we'll address that at the end. So Seema, if you could read the questions, please.
Thank you, Joe. The first question that we have is how this pandemic has affected the global supply chain management, and what are the measures being taken by the countries to streamline the supply chain?
Okay, fine. So we may have covered that, but keep going, and then the panelists can address each of these. Yep.
All right. The second question that we have is, should the companies look for more local supply chains or diversify their supply chains to add resilience to the economy?
Very good.
Moving ahead, the third question is, as we are on the topic of sustainable and ethical aspects of business, how do manufacturers in poor nations in Asia make sure that they get fair price from investments from European Western buyers? Poor nations stay at the beck and call of the Western buyers. How regulations must be there to improve?
Thank you.
The fourth question that we have is, do you feel that the COVID pandemic has made organizations more socially and environmentally sustainable? Would it lead to a reduction in globalization as a measure to reduce supply chain risk disruption?
Okay.
The next one is, the freight cost is fluctuating, port services are delayed, and depends on China for sourcing. How do you think we can minimize the risk of disruptions in supply chain? I think, yeah.
Good. Are there
those are the
any
questions.
more? Okay. Good.
There are a couple of more, but they are part of the same questions. They can be covered.
Okay, good. So, I mean, there's a general streamlining global supply chains. There's this question about how much is this about simplifying and focusing supply chains more locally versus diversifying. What's the best risk strategy? Going with a few local and close to you, or going with many to spread risk? Is COVID making businesses more sustainable, more socially, environmentally conscious? There's one about the ethical aspects to trade and a fair price, and then this sort of global disruption with China. So I would ask the panelists to do. So we have 13 minutes left. So I think if you could each make some final remarks and pick up one or two of these questions. If you would also like to make any points, just like a final recommendation for business or for policymakers, that'd be great. And I think if you could keep to 2.5 minutes each, that will leave us with a minute at the end to close on time for everyone. So, I mean, Rosalind, would you be happy to go first?
Great. I'd say for the experience we've had so far, it's to be more resilient. It would be better for most businesses, the leadership of most businesses, think about diversifying. So have the global supply chains, have the local supplies as well, but ensure that the compliance and the regulations are working for whichever set of suppliers you choose. Do not compromise on quality. Do not compromise on the human rights aspects of the people that work for these other businesses. As you're growing, you're carrying your suppliers and then you're carrying your customers along with you on this particular journey. I'd like to emphasize that. And surely, businesses are becoming more socially and environmentally conscious, if you ask me. But we need to be journeying along with our suppliers and with our customers along with them.
Thank you, Rosalind. Xiaomin.
Yes, thank you. I agree with Rosalind totally, because you have to nurture a relationship building with your local suppliers and global suppliers. But more diversification is needed, and I feel we need to also cater to the domestic demands and the supply. So to avert risk, more domestic supply chains have to be at the global standards. And to do that, we have to actually ask the bigger players in the industry to actually start hand-holding the process with their supply chains to make them socially, economically, and environmentally compliant. And also, I think at the policy level, I think there was a question about the European buyers. I think there must be more interaction, more communication, more information sharing, and also taking on more responsibility by both parties. This can only happen from a national and regional perspective and a global perspective where governments act together. We have the WTO on certain grounds, but somehow the WTO has not been as. I think we need to take those decisions at the national level and take it on at a global level. So that's very important. I would only like to add that also the dependency on China, we've seen through this pandemic, the whole dependency of the world towards China, Chinese product, has really created a lot of gray area where we need to sort of train out local supply chains. And how can we do that? With actually reducing our risk, just concentrating, not saying that we don't need China, we need China, but at the same time, having those diversification at the local level. So it's a global, local model that I believe in. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So Suraj, I mean, we've got, you know, is this a local strategy or a diversification strategy for sourcing? Is COVID making companies more sustainable and ethical? What about issues of sustainability and ethics with poor countries and a fair price? And then this kind of globalization being disrupted, you know, in reliance on China. Any remarks?
Yeah, Joe. Final remarks, as I mentioned during the course of my address, that essentially the products which had the high dependency upon the foreign sources got more disrupted than the ones which were. So this makes a very strong case that diversification of supply base, widening of supply base, that to domestic supply base is probably going to be the order of the day. That is something which is going to help the companies in future to combat any kind of such situation. And in fact, if you look at the government of India's mission, that is specifically the Prime Minister of India's mission of Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is translated into English, means basically a self-reliant India. So essentially, this kind of a strategy will be in sync with the government mission. And in fact, if you look at the public procurement order, which I will not go into detail, which was already framed some about 3 years back, which has been amended on 4th of June, which has incorporated two kind of classes, class 1 and class 2 supplier, which is really in sync with this Atmanirbhar Bharat or Self-Reliant India mission, which really gives preference to the local suppliers having local indigenous content of above 50%, class 1 supplier, and class 2 supplier having local value addition or content of 20 to 50%. So essentially, this kind of an approach will not only help the companies in avoiding the risk associated with the supply chain, will also provide them wider flexibility, and this also provides the companies to forge strategic alliances with global partners, with global players, be it in the form of technology tie-up, be it in the form of a joint venture, be it in the form of a contract manufacturing, be it in the form of a licensed production. So even in respect of engineering companies or engineering products, this suits well, this augurs well for the entire industry per se. So this is what I wanted to say in nutshell. And just to conclude, I wish to acknowledge and thank the hosts and organizers for giving the opportunity to be part of the panel in this particular event. So I express my sincere thanks to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shubha, your responses to the questions and any final remarks you'd like to share.
Right. So as we are looking at the recovery and building back better, it's absolutely critical to focus on human rights, to focus on social aspects, people, and this is very important for ensuring resilience in future, for future challenges, and to ensure, sustainable and responsible supply chains. And there are there's no other way. I mean, that's the only way forward. And I think, to answer the question, there's been a realization all around, of the importance of these issues. The second thing I'd like to highlight is, given the, magnitude of the challenges between us, organizations and, whether it's business, whether it's others, need to think big and act big. And they really need to look at the partnership approach, cross-sectoral collaboration. I think that was one of the themes that came, and given the economic and social impact, scarce resources, it's all the more important to leverage those, existing resources and build on the strengths of each organization. Issues are huge, complex. I mean, if you're looking at supply chains, these are, systemic issues. As I mentioned, poverty, vulnerability, and unless a cross-sectoral approach is taken, we are not going to be able to move the needle. And last but not the least, I think that was also came, in the comments of some of the panelists, that the importance of, capability development, supply chain, to kind of train them, to make them understand, what are the ethical practices, what are the legal requirements, is the right way of doing business. That's extremely important. Now, companies like Coca-Cola have the capability to do that. In fact, a lot of part of what people like me do is, to work with, our business, work with the supply chain constituents. But I think, for smaller businesses, the SMEs, etc., that's where organizations like the UN Global Compact, the Alliance for Integrity and other bodies can, look at organizing, sessions where there is capability building. So thank you so much once again to the organizers. Thanks. And to Joe and to my panelists, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Shubha. So thanks very much. And also to everybody who posted a question, a big thank you. I've got a few reflections on these questions that came in and also on, what was said. So, but by the panelists. So, let me first just say, in response to these questions. So what I have seen in working with businesses, and I work mainly with companies in India, but not exclusively. But what I've seen is that COVID has put a really sharp focus on the social aspect of responsible business. And I know businesses on this call, I think, have always had that. But I think that, right across the board, it's really hit home, the social aspect. I think that's been a huge impact. I think that there's no doubt that COVID has accelerated. There was already a trend away from globalization. And Mr. Birla, who is an industrialist based in Mumbai in India, in his business at the start of the year, he talked about a decade of globalization and the need for his business to, to work out how to be effective and prosperous and sustainable in a decade where national ownership, national production, content, and so on was going to be more important. And COVID, like many things, has accelerated that. I think that there are questions for developing countries in this new world order, because a lot of work of organizations like the Global Compact and my organization, WBCSD, has been focused on how to extend the benefits of globalization to as many people as possible in emerging economies. But if globalization is in retreat, then what is the strategy for developing countries to grow and create the jobs that are needed for the well-being of their people? So there's big questions there. I think that this thing about a fair price, is a critical issue and should go into trade deals, explicitly. I think that climate is having a higher role in international trade agreements and tariffs, and the social side, I think we need to see there. Let me respond to the fantastic, or attempt to summarize the fantastic interventions by the four panelists, which I'm going to summarize as first, people, a focus on people, trust, partnerships, the employees, customers, vendors, business partners. And this very important thing about continuing to invest in people as well. It's not just continuing operations and supply, it's continuing to invest in people. Secondly, this crucial piece about understanding cash flow and liquidity, not only your own, but in the whole system that you're in, because that's another contagion that can disrupt your business. Thirdly, technology. And we've all picked up lots of things to do with technology and discovered we can do all sorts of things we didn't know. But the application of technologies that have been around for 5 or 10 years is really accelerating and being applied in this space. And then this aspect of trade that was discussed. And last of all, just this point about no compromise. This is not the moment to compromise on responsibility. This is not the moment to compromise on quality. This is not the moment to compromise on assurance and documentation and so on. So those are the key points that I took from the very good panel. A big thanks to them. Let me lastly say thank you to the Alliance for Integrity and to the UN Global Compact Network India for organizing today. You will receive, all of you, in your inbox a survey, and it would really help the team if you could complete that survey and let us know what you think. And lastly, just to say, we have some resources at my organization. If you go to wbcsd.org, we have some resources on COVID response, which will complement what you've heard today and the work of the Global Compact and the Alliance for Integrity and others. So thanks very much. We're going to end the webinar now. It's 7:30 in India and 3 p.m. in Central Europe. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.